Welcome to Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young.
Hey everyone, welcome back to an all-new episode of Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young. I am your host, Mike Leon. Clarke here is a seasoned family law attorney and consultant and expert witness who helps the courts understand the psychological realities behind high-conflict custody disputes. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the line between protective parenting and so-called parental alienation. Clarke, it's good to see you as always. Let's start with the broad here, which is the term parental alienation. What is it? And explain it.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Parent alienation is a term that's bandied about quite a bit, and it's actually within the legal community and the psychological community. It has gone through quite a tortured history. There was a chapter in parent alienation where there was a schism within the legal community and the psychological communities, both of them, where it was being called parent alienation syndrome. So that raged for about 20 years. That debate has been pretty much resolved. I think there is universal agreement that, first of all, that parent alienation is real, it exists, and that it actually does show up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that's written by the American Psychiatric Association, Psychological Association, for defining various mental health problems. So probably the place to start with this is going to be just to read what the definition is right now. And to begin with, I'm going to show you a book which is by a fellow whose last name is Joshi. He's an attorney. This is a book published by the American Bar Association, and it is, to me, the current best publication on how attorneys and judges and anyone who is involved in a child custody proceeding involving parent alienation should read. There's a lot of good practical pointers in here. It's called Litigating, Evaluating, and Presenting Parental Alienation. And so he starts off right at page 4, and he says this, that parent alienation includes behaviors such as persistent disparagement of one or both parents by the other parent. Typically, as a result of such behaviors, a child affected by parent relationship distress displays impaired functioning in behavioral, cognitive, affective, and/or physical domains. Examples of behavioral problems include oppositionality and the child's reluctance or refusal to have a relationship with a parent without good cause. That's parent alienation. And he says examples are of cognitive problems may include the child adopting the false belief that the rejected parent is evil or dangerous. So that's how he defines parent alienation. And then he says something really important for everybody who's viewing this, who's involved in these cases. The concept of parent alienation is covered by DSM-5 under 3 specific diagnoses. 1, child affected by parental relationship distress, which is V61.29. 2, parent-child relational problems, which is in the DSM-5 at V61.20, and 3, child psychological abuse, which is 995.51 in the DSM-5. So that is the professional's, if you will, touchstone for where you begin with a judge, with a court, with anyone, a child custody evaluator, to discuss this issue. Right. Then you can get into the weeds a little bit more. You can get into the DSM-5, and you can go to the pages where they discuss child psychological abuse and child neglect and borderline personality disorder and factitious disorder imposed upon another, all the sorts of things and diagnoses that are possible in a borderline custody proceeding.
So, Clark, let me ask you, because you just mentioned about BPD, and a lot of our episodes have been around that. So, what's the relationship or correlation between parent alienation and borderline personality disorder?
There is a direct and very positive and strong correlation between parent alienation and borderline personality disorder. There is a common uh, phrase that we say that while not all parents who alienate are borderlines, all borderlines alienate. So, what I'm going to talk about and what we've been talking about over several episodes is are borderline cases where parent alienation is a variable. So, what I'm saying also applies to non borderline cases for those people who are involved in cases where there's parent alienation, but the other parent isn't a borderline or a narcissist.
So, Clark, in previous episodes, we've talked about the court system and a focal point of the judges. So, how can judges distinguish between a child who has been alienated from one parent, let's say by the other parent, and a child who's been estranged from a parent because of that parent's behavior towards the child?
That is an incredibly difficult objective for any attorney. I don't care how seasoned they are, but helping the court understand that the behaviors, which both parties will describe, and they'll probably even agree that so and so parent is engaged in this behavior. The question then becomes uh, who is describing the behavior in a way with the nuances that are going to help the court identify whether the child is alienated from the alienated parent because of that parent's own poor parenting practices versus the case where the other parent is alienating the child and trying to sever and interfere with the first parents, if you will, the targeted parents' relationship with the child. We could spend hours on this, and I do spend hours every day, every week, dealing with cases where this is the central issue. And most of the time, it's going to involve hiring expert witnesses, namely psychologists. It will involve enrolling, if you will, people who are familiar with the family system and who can describe and help the court identify whether the behaviors we're discussing are alienating behaviors or estrangement behaviors. And that becomes clear after a while. Now, you may be going back to court 4 or 5 times or more over a period of 6 months or a year, or maybe even a year and a half, before the court really gets it. Now, segueing into the borderline cases in particular, it's very difficult because borderlines are normally pretty intelligent. Now, you got to give credit where credit's due. They are absolute masters at ascribing their own behaviors to the other party. So typically, for example, I'll give you one example. Um, there are just tens of thousands of domestic violence restraining order requests being applied for and filed every day in family courts all over the US and everywhere else. And one of the hallmarks is you'll see in a borderline case where the borderline will project their behaviors onto the other party and say, we'll say mother's filing the DVRO. So father is doing all these things. But in reality, after you've been in court and you bring it back and you show proof and you get evidence, and you get witnesses, and you keep diaries and logs, and you record every child exchange, and you stay away from the other parent so that everyone can see the actual behaviors and the parenting style, if you will, of the borderline. Those are the sorts of things you're looking for to document to help the court. And it's, as I say, it takes a long time for the courts to finally go, oh, I get it. What she said at the beginning of this case was just a confession of her behavior that she was projecting onto you. And I call that this incredible area, a confession projection. It happens all the time.
So, Clark, you touched on there, and we've touched on in previous episodes when judges don't get it right. Document all this evidence, like you mentioned, present it. So the judge gets it wrong, let's say, and labels the normal range parent as the alienating parent. How do you go about correcting that in justice?
So let's do a quick hypothetical. Let's go back to the domestic violence restraining order. The allegations are all false, but the restraining order is going to be granted because the rule set that is, especially in California, which is probably one of the most egregious states for they're a factory of handing out really unnecessary domestic violence restraining orders. The threshold for getting a restraining order is very low. So what ends up happening is you get the temporary restraining order. The next time you come into court, it'll be a hearing on shortened time on whether or not the restraining order should become permanent, which means in California, it can last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And once that happens, basically, the court has acted as an unintentional, unwitting enabler of the pathology that is alienating the child, because now the alienating parent has sole custody of the child, and the parent who is acting as the I'll be very graphic. They're the only parent that stands between the child and the child's doom, psychologically speaking, has been taken out of the picture entirely, because now the father, in this case, is hypothetical, cannot see the child, and the mother has 100% control, which allows her, going back to the parent alienation, to alienate the child, badmouth, disparage, and basically poison the child against the other parent. So if nothing is done over the period of the restraining order, the child has to align with the pathological parent because no one else is going to protect the child. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And at the end of the day, the child is lost to humanity. The child will never have a normal, well-adjusted adult relationship. It'll never happen. They're just destroyed psychologically. Yeah. So to counterbalance that, you have to go into court repeatedly. We've talked about this before. But you have to keep going into court repeatedly, filing requests for orders in California, motions in other states. We're asking to modify the custody orders, where you're asking for more time, you're asking for it for supervised visitation, then you ask for overnights again, then you ask for non-supervised visitation, and then and this takes months. This is like every 5-6 months you're going back in. And in that time, something miraculous will happen. The borderline will self-sabotage, because the borderlines cannot keep up the pretext of not being borderlines forever. And whether it's 3 months, 6 months, or a year, that facade is going to drop away. And that is when you need to be ready to go into court with everything. You have to have the exhibits, you have to have videos, you have to have recordings, you have to have whatever you've gotten over the entire length of the relationship, whether it's a marriage or not, or a paternity case, it doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. You've got to go in with all the evidence, and that's what I just mentioned. The text messages, the photographs, the videos, the other witnesses, the other family members. Sometimes, for example, your best witnesses will be a sister or brother or relationship of the borderline, because they know them better than anybody, right. Or a friend, or a prior relationship they were in. This is a gold mine. I've used this in the past with great effect. And that is that by definition, borderlines cannot maintain a stable relationship, and they all blow up eventually. So you will have 1, 2, 3, or 5 other relationships where people will come in and say, this is how this person is psychologically built. This is typical of their behaviors. This is how they destroy people. This is how they psychologically maim you. And in the DSM-5, and I'll stop here in a second, the same criteria that you use for child psychological abuse and child neglect are the same criteria, the same symptoms that you'll see in the DSM-5 for spousal abuse and spousal neglect. And they're all in there. And I have to tell you, the DSM-5 is a great resource if you know how to use it, but most attorneys don't.
Clarke, let me ask you here as we put a bow on this episode. For the parent that's listening to this right now and they're terrified of being falsely accused of parent alienation, trying to protect their child, what guiding principles should they hold on to as they try to navigate the family court system?
All right. So first of all, they have to educate themselves about what BPD and parent alienation are. Then the steps that they are going to take is things like you can never, ever have an exchange with someone who's alienating your child, especially if they're a BPD, face to face without it being recorded or in some way being documented. Lots of times with these DVROs, the restrained party is not allowed to record. I mean, it's just insane. And so they can't protect themselves, but the other party is allowed to record. So you have to overcome that obstacle. And again, when you're terrified of the parent alienation accusation, you will probably already be aware that your child at a certain age, and we can talk about this another time, but parent alienation isn't just something that just shows up one day and it's there. It's on a spectrum, and you have to be able to identify the early onset of the symptoms, but the child may not exhibit those symptoms until they're 5, 6, 7 years old, or maybe reaching puberty. That's when it usually shows up in a big way. So you're actually you're relying totally on the alienating parent's behavior. So you have to document that. The second thing they can do, and this is important, you get a good therapist involved for the child, who the child will hopefully, if it's a young child, will engage in play therapy, which will expose the borderline's behavior indirectly. When they're older, they may talk about how they have these, as I just read at the beginning of this episode, how they have this no good reason for not wanting to see the normal range parent. And so the psychologist can testify that the child is showing symptoms of pathology that aren't mirroring a proper custody arrangement. And beyond that, you're just looking at teachers and friends and other witnesses who can help document the alienating behavior or the pathological behavior, the borderline behavior, because again, there is that one-to-one correlation between BPD and parent alienation.
Yeah. Clarke, thank you for the time and insights and analysis as always. I appreciate it, my friend.
Thank you for the time. Thanks for having me.
And that's it for today's episode of Vampire Divorce with attorney Clarke Young. If you want to reach out to Clarke and learn more about his work, visit clarkeyoung.com today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review or comment or share the episode with someone who needs to hear it. As always, I'm Mike Leon. See everybody next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.